What if I told you one man changed millions of minds without ruling a single nation? Most people have never heard his name yet. His ideas still shape the choices you make every single day. His name was Edward Bernays, yet most people have never heard of him. But his ideas quietly shaped advertising, politics, public opinion, and the choices people still make today. Some call him the father of public relations. Others believe he changed how millions formed their opinions. To understand how he did it, we have to return to where the story truly began. The year was 1891. Europe was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Factories were replacing old traditions while new ideas challenged everything people once believed. But hidden inside this changing world, history was quietly preparing someone no one expected. On November 23, 1891, a baby named Edward Bernays was born in Vienna. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about him, or so everyone believed. But one connection inside his family would quietly shape the rest of his life. That connection led to one of history's most influential thinkers, Sigmund Freud. Freud wasn't asking what people did. He wanted to know why they did it. That simple question would one day escape psychology and quietly reshape the entire world. Edward's family later moved to New York, searching for new opportunities in a rapidly changing America. America offered endless possibilities, but it also became the perfect place to observe human behavior. No one could have imagined this young immigrant would one day influence millions of people. But before that happened, one discovery would completely change the direction of his life. But the ideas surrounding Edward's childhood were unlike anything most people had ever encountered. He grew up surrounded by conversations about psychology, society, and the hidden forces behind human behavior. At the time, he couldn't possibly know how valuable those conversations would become. Years later, those same ideas would quietly change the modern world. Then came the moment that would change everything. Edward enrolled at Cornell University to study agriculture. But something else captured his attention far more than farming. He became fascinated by one question: why do people think the way they do? That single question would eventually become the foundation of his life's work. After graduating, Edward wasn't interested in becoming a farmer. Instead, he was pulled toward newspapers, publicity, and public attention. Without realizing it, he had taken the first step toward changing history. But the world was about to face a crisis that would completely change his future. Then came an opportunity that would quietly change everything. A struggling theater production needed publicity, and Edward accepted the challenge. Instead of selling tickets, he decided to sell curiosity, and it worked better than anyone expected. But Edward had just discovered something far more valuable than publicity itself. Then the world changed, and Edward saw an opportunity that almost no one else could see. The First World War was about to transform politics and public opinion forever. And this time, Edward wasn't just watching history, he was about to become part of it. But what happened next would eventually change advertising forever. Then came an invitation, one that would completely change Edward's future. The United States had entered the First World War. The government needed more than soldiers, it needed public support. Here's the surprising part: winning people's minds became just as important as winning the war. Edward was invited to join the Committee on Public Information. Its mission was simple: convince ordinary Americans that the war was worth supporting. But Edward noticed something that almost everyone else completely ignored. Facts alone rarely changed people's minds. Emotions did. And that realization would become the foundation of everything he built afterward. Edward had learned something powerful. People could be influenced without ever realizing it. That lesson stayed with him long after the war ended. But what he did next would change advertising forever. The war finally ended, but Edward believed the real discovery had only just begun. He kept asking himself one question: what if the same methods used during wartime could also work in peacetime? And that single question would quietly reshape modern business forever. Edward wasn't trying to manipulate people. He wanted to understand what truly influenced their decisions. He realized people rarely made choices using logic alone. The answer surprised him, and it may surprise you too. People first felt, and only afterward looked for reasons to justify their decisions. Edward now understood something most businesses had completely overlooked. Products didn't become successful because they were better. They became successful because people believed they were. And that insight opened a door almost no one else could see. Soon, companies from across America would begin asking for his help. His first clients weren't looking for better products, they were looking for bigger crowds. Most companies tried to convince people with advertisements alone. Edward believed they were solving the wrong problem. Instead of changing the product, he decided to change how people felt about it. And the campaign that proved his theory is still studied more than a century later. The opportunity arrived through an unusual client, a Broadway theater production that was almost empty. Ticket sales were collapsing, and traditional advertising wasn't helping. Most people would have bought more advertisements. Edward chose a completely different path. He didn't try to sell tickets, he created a story that newspapers wanted to publish. And within days, something extraordinary began to happen. The newspapers covered the story exactly as Edward had hoped. People weren't buying tickets because of advertisements anymore. They were buying them because everyone was talking about the show. And that's when Edward realized attention could spread faster than advertising. That discovery became the foundation of modern public relations. But his next campaign would become one of the most controversial in history. Then came the campaign that would make Edward Bernays famous across America. The company wasn't asking him to improve cigarettes, it wanted him to change society itself. What happened next is still debated almost 100 years later. Edward didn't begin with cigarettes, he began with psychology. He understood the real obstacle wasn't the product, it was the public's belief. So he asked himself one dangerous question. What if smoking could become a symbol instead of a habit? The answer would shock the entire country. Edward secretly invited a small group of young women, but no one around them knew the real plan. On Easter Sunday, they blended into the crowd along Fifth Avenue. Then, at exactly the right moment, the women lit their cigarettes together in full public view. By the next morning, America couldn't stop talking about it. Reporters didn't describe it as a cigarette campaign, they described it as a movement for women's freedom. Overnight, public opinion began shifting in a direction almost nobody expected, and cigarette sales among women began climbing soon after. Edward never appeared in the headlines, but his idea was everywhere. He had proved something far more valuable than selling a product. He had discovered how to shape public opinion without people realizing it. Before long, politicians, presidents, and some of the world's biggest corporations wanted the same advantage. He wasn't changing products anymore, he was changing how millions of people thought. And this was only the beginning. Then Edward published a book, and its title alone made people uncomfortable. In 1928, he called it propaganda. Most people hear that word today and immediately think of lies. But Edward meant something much deeper and far more powerful. Edward believed people rarely made decisions with logic, they followed emotions first. That's why Edward never tried to change facts, he changed the feelings attached to them. Soon, governments began studying the very same methods, and before most people noticed, his ideas quietly spread across the world. But Edward believed something even more powerful. If you could influence emotions, people would often change their own decisions without realizing why. And that's exactly why his methods are still studied today. Years later, Edward accepted a client that would make his legacy far more controversial than cigarettes ever did. This time, the goal wasn't selling fruit, it was changing how an entire nation was seen. Edward knew that if he changed the story, the public would change its conclusions on its own. Newspapers soon began repeating the same message again and again. And slowly, public opinion began moving in exactly the direction the campaign needed. But the campaign didn't stop with newspapers. Soon, officials in Washington were paying close attention. In 1954, Guatemala's government was overthrown. But here's the question historians still debate today: how much of this happened because of Edward's campaign? Some believe his influence was enormous. Others say the story was much more complicated. But one fact has never really been disputed. Edward Bernays permanently changed the way governments, companies, and media try to influence public opinion. And here's the part that should make all of us stop for a second. Every day, thousands of companies still compete for one thing: your attention. The tools have changed, but human psychology hasn't. That's why Edward Bernays is still remembered as the man who transformed public relations and changed the way the modern world thinks about influence. So the next time you believe a choice was completely your own, ask yourself one simple question: was it really? But Edward wasn't finished yet. This was only the beginning. Instead of changing reality, Edward focused on changing the story people would hear about reality. And then something unusual started happening. But newspapers were only the first move. Edward wanted something much bigger. Instead of asking journalists what to write, he focused on controlling what they would experience. And that's where the real power of public relations began to reveal itself. But Edward's campaign had already done something far more dangerous. It had started changing minds thousands of miles away. Across the United States, more and more people began accepting the same version of the story. And once public opinion had shifted, decisions inside Washington became much easier to justify. Then, in June 1954, the situation reached its breaking point. A CIA-backed operation, known today as Operation PBS Success, helped remove Guatemala's President Jacobo Arbenz from power. But here's what still divides historians. No serious historian claims Edward Bernays alone caused the coup, but many agree his public relations campaign helped shape the climate that made intervention easier to justify. But the story didn't end when the government fell. For Guatemala, it was only the beginning. Guatemala entered decades of political instability and later a long civil conflict that lasted for many years. Historians still debate how much responsibility belongs to each player, but one fact remains undeniable. But perhaps Edward Bernays' greatest victory wasn't in Guatemala, it was proving that public opinion itself could be engineered. Governments noticed it, corporations noticed it, and soon the entire public relations industry was learning from the same playbook. And that's why historians still argue about his methods, but almost none deny his influence. Edward Bernays died in 1995, but his greatest invention never did. Because today, you don't need someone to control your mind, you only need someone to guide your attention. Different technology, the same psychology. Edward Bernays didn't invent propaganda, but he taught the modern world how to package it as persuasion. So the next time a product feels irresistible, a headline feels convincing, or an idea feels completely your own, ask yourself one question. Who planted that thought first?